Want to say welcome. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon for Oil by Rail's Last Stand, the Zenith energy story. And we're going to get started right away. And we would like to begin today with a land acknowledgement. We recognize the unique and enduring relationship that exists between Native people and their traditional territories. We respectfully acknowledge that the lands we live and work on rest on the traditional territories of Native people who have cared for these lands and waters since time immemorial and continue to do so today. Again, thank you all for coming today. I'm very excited about this conversation happening, and I want to get started because we have some great panelists with us. Today we have Julie Carter, who's a policy analyst with the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission, and Columbia Riverkeeper staff attorney Aaron Saylor. And after we hear from Aaron and Julie today, we are going to have a little Q&A. So please be ready to put your questions in the chat, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. And I encourage you all to go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat with your name and where you're joining from. During the webinar, I'll be adding some useful links and additional information in the chat as well for folks to reference. So keep an eye on that. My name is Kate Murphy. I'm a community organizer with Columbia Riverkeeper based out of Portland, Oregon, and I have the privilege of working with and collaborating with amazing community members and partners. I have a master's in public health with a focus in environmental systems and human health from Oregon Health and Sciences University, and I work to support community members along the Columbia River in Oregon and Washington, engaging residents in fighting to protect our region from fossil fuel refineries, pipelines, terminals, and other threats to the Columbia River ecosystem. And I also work to save salmon and orca by stopping pollution and pushing for the removal of the 4 lower Snake River dams. So we are at a really critical point in this Zenith Energy Oil by Rail campaign. A major decision is about to be made by the city of Portland about the Zenith facility in Northwest Portland. And this decision is going to affect the health and safety of our communities now and for the future. And after years of community advocacy, we are in a moment right now where we are really making progress. Our voices are being heard, and we really are in a place to demand that we move towards protective solutions that will help build resilience in our communities rather than liabilities. So as we fight for environmental justice in the face of this climate emergency, Portland has this opportunity to say no to these threats from this dirty oil company and really assert our vision for a safe and sustainable city that values the health and safety of our communities and our environment over profits for fossil fuel companies. So we all know that in the last year, we've experienced a lot of historic moments, the fires, the heat wave, the ice storms and droughts, and we're in all of this in the midst of a global pandemic. And I'm really excited to make history with all of you this summer as we put an end to Oil by Rail in Portland. That is my hope. So I'm going to pass it to Julie first. So Julie Carter, thank you so much for being here. Julie's been a policy analyst with Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission since 2000, providing policy direction and legal analysis to CRITFIC and supporting CRITFIC's member tribes in treaty fishing rights protection. At CRITFIC, Julie wears 2 hats. One is lending expertise on issues related to Clean Water Act, natural resources, Native American treaty rights, and Indian law, oil and hazardous materials spill response, and energy law, including FERC licensed projects such as hydropower and natural gas. Wearing her second hat, Julie supports internal CRITFIC processes such as managing government contracts and assisting with employment and labor law issues. Julie earned her JD from American University, Washington College of Law, and her LLM in Environmental and Natural Resources Law from Lewis and Clark Law School. In her free time, Julie can be found hiking and cycling and paddling outrigger canoes, and we're so excited to have you here today. Julie, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. I appreciate being here talking about all of this. I'm not going to talk directly on Zenith until I get to the end of the story. And before I start, I'm going to have 3 important points. The comments that I make today are all of my own and the errors as well. I work for Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission, but I want to say that I don't speak for our member tribes. Our member tribes are sovereign nations and they have their own staff and policymakers. 3, I'm also not a tribal member. I can only speak to my experience working for my clients. So with that, I wanted to, I have quite a few pictures because I feel like pictures sort of lend context and a sense of place. And for some people who are on this, it might be a walk down memory lane, but I think it's important to look back at where we've been and because there's a lot of tools and a lot of lessons learned that we can use for the future as we move towards protecting this thin green line we've created in this area. This slide, go back just one really quick. This is our statement. These are our tenets. CRIFIC was created to create a unified voice in the management of fishery resources. Our goals are to restore the fish runs, to protect treaty fishing rights, and we have to coordinate intertribal enforcement. By most federal agencies, we're considered a branch of tribal government. So next, please. This is a map of the Columbia River Basin. So the bigger shaded area is the Columbia River Basins from the headwaters in Canada and all the way over to Wyoming, the Snake River. The colored areas are the ceded territories of our CRIFIC member tribes, and the darker areas are the reservations. But know that to these tribes, the whole basin was part of their ceded area because this is where they lived and gathered and fished. Next, please. In 1855, the treaty tribes signed agreements with the United States government, the right of taking fish in their usual and accustomed places. And I think the important point here is that they reserved these rights. These are rights that they had. They reserved them, so they're not special and they weren't given to them by the government. Over a series of, over the decades in the 1900s, there were a series of court cases litigating this term, especially the usual and accustomed term. And you might know some of the cases, US v. Washington, US v. Oregon, which ended up dividing harvest allocation among the white settlers and the tribes. It also set up an obligation of co-management between the tribes and the states and the feds. So CRIFIC was created in the 1970s to help fill that resource gap because the tribes didn't have technical and legal staff to help them in this co-management responsibility. So we were created to help fill that gap, provide legal and technical support, and provide a unified voice. Next, please. This is a really broken down map of just part of the river, but I wanted to point it out that this is called the Zone 6 Treaty Fishery Zone. And this is where, through these agreements, these court cases, there was an agreement that the states of Washington, Oregon, and the tribes said, this little part where it has the Zone 6 is where the tribes, are allowed commercial fisheries. And then the green section in the lower part is where certain gillnet fisheries can happen and sport fisheries for the states. So this is just an agreement. It doesn't designate where the tribes consider their usual and accustomed. And in fact, there's a lot of subsistence fisheries that go on in other parts of this basin, including the Willamette, and Willamette Falls, for one, is lamprey harvesting. So we're not, limited to this area, but that was what a management agreement came up to. And so CRIFIC CRIFIC has basically, we've taken over the role of maintaining different aspects of this Zone 6. So we have an enforcement office that is based out of Hood River that manages this area. And because the tribes now have built up their own technical and legal staff, we tend to focus on this area. Next, please. So these are pictures that I wanted to include of our fishing sites that are along the river. The first up in the corner you'll see is a platform that's near the Wind River. Then there's the Cascade Treaty Fishing Access Site, the Underwood in Lieu fishing site, and then this is the fishers you see processing their salmon is at Dallasport. These sites, so when the federal government built the dams on the Columbia River, they flooded a lot of settlements that were along the river. And this is disparity in treatment. The federal government rebuilt the white settlements, but they didn't rebuild the native villages. And so over the course of the years, with a lot of advocacy, we've managed to get sites along the river that are set out for the specific use of tribal members. So non-tribal members cannot access these sites. But I just wanted to give you a taste of what it looks like along the river. I also want to point out for the rest of this discussion is the rail line that's along this. So the rail runs along both the Washington side and the Oregon side of the river, and cuts and intersects a lot of these treaty fishing access sites. And that's an important impact. Let me make sure. Oh, and I wanted to also point out, jurisdictionally, these sites are very interesting. We maintain them, but they're considered federal sites, and Washington State actually calls them Indian country, and they treat them as Indian reservations. So let's see the next slide, please. So we're gonna jump to my first experience dealing with fossil fuel transport projects. Up to this point, I was working exclusively on Clean Water Act issues, water quality, and FERC hydropower dams. I got a call from Columbia Riverkeeper, and they said, "We really think you need to pay attention to this." We went down and looked at it. I really love this picture. It was actually the proponent created this. It's a beautiful picture of the Brentwood Landing area, but they superimposed their drawings of rendition of their project. And I always love their green mossy tanks, you know, so it looks all nice and bucolic and pretty. But it is a really great area because the navigation channel of Columbia is on the left side, so it kind of goes past it. But this channel that you're looking at is called Clifton Channel, and it is a really important rearing habitat for Snake River fall Chinook. Snake River fall Chinook travel an immense distance. When they're out migrating, the juveniles need to spend some time in brackish water. It's partially salt water before they head out to the ocean. And this is a really important nursery for them. So of course the Nez Perce tribe, which are an Idaho tribe, saw this as really an impact that they did not feel was is good for their fishery. So they joined in this project. And you know, honestly, this project was doomed from the start because there were so many jurisdictions that affected it. It needed a FERC license. Oregon and Washington both had authorities like Coastal Zone Management Act authority and Clean Water Act authority. NOAA Fisheries, because there was ESA listed species here, was going to have to do a biological opinion. I mean, you wanted to like get a project that was going to have every permit possible. This was the location. But I think, you know, even though I say it's doomed from the start, I think what really helped us was the grassroots activism, because it elevated this project, which I think would have snuck under the radar because of where it's located. You don't really see this location from the roads. You know, the groundswell grassroots activism just brought it up to a level where the public was incredibly aware of what was going on. So I would say, while the permits were definitely killed it, I think the negative publicity and the elevation of this was extremely important. But don't forget the technical aspects, because what was finally the final straw on the camel's back on this project was that we hired an expert to look at the applicants' studies, and our expert said they needed this and this and this study. So that helped support NOAA Fisheries and the Oregon agencies to say, yeah, we need more studies, and the company said we're done. So that was, that was a really good, long, arduous campaign, but can show you how different diverse groups can come together and kill a big project, a well-funded project. That was the good old days. So next, please. This picture was sort of ironic and slightly humorous. These are Yakima tribal elders. They were out on the river doing a blessing. I'm not sure what it was for, but one of their staff took a picture, and just as they were taking a picture, this coal train goes by. Because I don't know if anybody knows, there's a coal plant in Centralia, Washington, and so there's approximately 3 to 4 coal trains a day that go through the gorge. So with coal dying in the U.S. and coal plants shuttering, the Powder River Basin was struggling. They still are struggling. And they saw the best market for their coal was Asia. And of course, in the way of that was the West Coast. And so they started looking, westward, figuring out a way to get their coal to market. When I talked to our commissioners about these projects, I was like, yeah, there's this coal project, but, I didn't really know much about it. Every one of them were jumping up and saying, we have got to stop this, because right now, the few coal trains that go through the gorge are horrible. This, every time the wind comes up, all this dust blows all over us. We're out there, doing our fishing and on our fishing sites, and it's really not good for our health. So there was immediate strong reaction to these coal terminals. And in fact, when we looked at the map and saw where the other were proposed, we coordinated with other tribes, because some of the issues, such as Gateway up in Lummi, they were trying to site it on tribal grounds. There was another project proposed for the Puerto Moro, and that would directly impede tribal fishing, because there were several fishing sites there. The tribes were very concerned about impacts of water quality, and of course the air quality was absolutely first on their minds. So next slide. All right. So this is a map, and it was specifically about coal export in the Northwest. And this is, early on. I like it because it's very simple. It shows you the rail lines that come from the Powder River Basin direction. So I wanted to point out that the 2 lines that are on either side of the Columbia Gorge, on the Washington and Oregon side, are the primary lines that a lot of these trains travel full, because going over the Leavenworth and through Yakima is much more difficult because of the Cascade Range. And so the grade is easier for trains to carry heavy loads through the gorge. I also thought it was interesting when I looked at this map. I hadn't looked at this in years, and those locations where the stars are, those were the different coal proposals. Well, they're also the same locations where there were LNG and crude by rail proposals. So these are ports that that the fossil fuel industry looked at and said, hey, this is a great place. This is a great idea. I mean, the fossil fuel industry was looking at all the pipelines are difficult to put in because of permits. And rail provided, less permits and far less oversight by federal and state and local. So and rail has been here forever, so has really strong legal authorities. A lot of rail preempts environmental laws. They think it preempts everything, but we disagree. But they have a strong lobby, and so fossil fuel industry was looking at this, going, this is a win-win for us. So next, please. So as we know, crude by rail started, and to be honest, I felt like it came in under the wire, under the radar. A lot of us were looking at these coal projects, and we're still fighting LNG projects, and but you know, the Bakken fields were just going gangbusters. They were, and then oil sands up in Canada was, you know, coming online, and so they, again, they're like the Powder River Basin. They needed a place, a market to send this product. I just wanted to know, you know, Bakken oil is very light and very explosive. Bitumen, which is the oil sands, is very heavy, and they both provide really unique challenges to spill responders for cleanup. Bakken is toxic to fish, but dissipates quickly, but bitumen is less toxic, but it hangs around and binds to everything. It binds to grasses and sediments and rocks, and it's impossible to clean. And, you know, when you look at the Exxon Valdez, which happened 7 years ago, they're still finding oil in many of the locations that they were unable to clean up. So, and one last thing I want to say about crude by rail is that, and it's important, is that it's transported generally in unit trains, which unit train is a single, is a bunch of, is a line of 10 cars that are a single product. And these unit trains are at least a mile long, sometimes more. And going back to what the tribes were concerned about with rail, is that as you know, they're trying to access their fishing sites, and as you put more trains on the tracks and they're longer, it's harder for treaty fishers to access their sites. So this was, as we started to figure out what was going on, the tribes were very, very concerned about that and their impacts to their fishing rights. But what really got our attention, next slide, please, was Lac Méganic, Quebec. And I always put in a photo of at least one bomb train, because this is what we're concerned about. And it happened a lot. These are 7 different explosions, and I lost track of how many, but there was a point where I was like, I think up to 12. That means double digits of how many derailments there were and explosions, and these are spills into riverways and into natural areas. I mean, every one of these, I look at it and I'm like, oh my gosh, that is a massive spill. It probably did a lot of damage. I mean, this stuff is dangerous. And in spill response, you call these type of accidents low probability, high consequence. But as we could see, this was becoming a lot more high probability, or at least medium probability. And you know, again, the tribes are very concerned about this. Next slide, because, you know, these projects were being proposed for areas like this one, which is in Oregon, and it is alive right now. Global Partners, Columbia Pacific Biorefinery, and as you see, this is a narrow area of the navigation channel. I'm on the Washington side when I took this picture, and that's the dock. They've actually upgraded the dock a little bit more, but it's still, this is farmland. This is a waterway where the salmon outmigrate, and there's not a lot of space there, and a lot of space for any sort of spill. And the impact would be significant. Next slide. And in the gorge, a lot of the rail looks like this. And, you know, there's not much space for it to, any kind of spill to go, but in the river. So the next slide. So, you know, and that's actually a crude train. It's a little hard to see. You know, 300 miles of the transportation corridor in the gorge goes along tribal fisheries, villages, and access sites. So um, this, increased rail traffic, as I said, impedes access to the river, to fishing platforms, to fishing sites. It also increases the risk of train strike, and that has happened to many families who have spent their life on the river. I've talked to a lot of fishers, and they can, talk about family members that they lost from train strike. And so the risk to the fishery for spill is just too great for most of the tribes to allow. So next, so this is a chart. You don't have to read it all, but I created this chart, probably updated it every week during the time when we were trying to get a handle on all the projects that we're going through. And there were coal and crude, and the refineries up in Puget Sound decided, hey, it's a great idea to like also include rail to, feed our refineries, because pipelines aren't working, or, we're having trouble with pipelines, and, we're not getting enough from our ships. So a fair number of crude trains that you see right now in the gorge are going up to those refineries. And we were just trying to get a handle on all of this, and we were writing down how big these projects were proposed for, what that meant in number of trains and number of ships, because we were trying to get our heads around what is the risk here. What are the impacts? What tools do we have to fight these? Because every project on this list was unique and would require different tools. And I highlighted for fun two of them, New Star Energy and Arc Terminals, and I'll talk about them at the very end. And Arc Terminals, by the way, is now called Zenith. So we were aware of it. It was there. We just didn't have enough information about it. Also, I wanted to say at this time, we were building coalitions. We would meet with the tribes of the area, not just our member tribes, but tribes up in Puget Sound and in Grays Harbor, and discussing these projects, because everybody was worried. Everybody was really concerned about what this would do to our resources and to our region. We coalitioned with environmental groups. We allied ourselves with state and federal agency staff, because even the states were trying to figure out how to deal with this, because especially with rail, the states felt like they didn't have enough tools to deal with it. The other thing that we did at my organization actually is we learned spill response training. Really interesting. If you ever want to try it, it's a fascinating area, very military. I'm now ICS trained, and I know about, but it's important because there's going to be crude rail that's coming through the gorge. We need to be ready to handle some of these consequences for these low probability, high consequence events. And then the last thing I just want to say is that all of these projects, all of them placed all the risks and burdens on the tribes, and no benefits to the tribes at all. And so, that has happened again and again and again over the decades, but especially with these projects. So the next slide. So I don't know how I'm doing in time, so I'm going to try to speed it up a little bit. But so Vancouver Energy Distribution Terminal, I call it Tesoro because that's what they started out. We litigated that. It was 5 weeks. It was very tough, but a lot of lessons learned. And I'm just going to give you the keys to our victory, because I don't want to go through all of the details of this. The site was proposed. This is Vancouver, Port of Vancouver. The most keys to our victory, it's important to have diversity of voices across the political and legal spectrum, and to engage in local communities and reach across divides. I cannot emphasize that enough. And I'll get to that in a minute, but the first thing that we did is that that we coordinated with the downtown development. So if any of you've gone to Vancouver and seen that the fancy new development, that, you know, I would not say that they follow the same political background that I do, but they were very interested in protecting their investment. And they were concerned about having these crude trains, you know, coming through and in this terminal located, you know, very close to their development. And so they came to us and asked us if, you know, they could join. And, you know, we thought it was great because we need to reach out to and listen to these communities. There are communities along the route that probably, you know, politically may be very conservative, but they don't want these dangerous trains going through their neighborhoods. So, you know, being able to open your ears and listen and allow for different voices is extremely important. And it's also important when you're in front of like a body like the Energy Facility Site Evaluation Council, FSEC, because then they see a whole array of people on, you know, in front of them, and I think that helped in the decision. We also need to be aware of BIPOC communities because you know, they, you know, just like tribes, impacts may affect these communities differently. You know, there's environmental justice issues that we may not be aware of, and so the folks, the people who lived in Fruit Valley were extremely important in our case. But probably the best thing that happened for the Tesoro case, next slide, was this. Sad to say, but on Friday at noon, I was busy filing exhibits for the Tesoro case. That was the due date. And I was getting on, and I get a call from my enforcement office, and they said, hey, it looks like one of those oil trains you were talking about has derailed. And so I was able to like fill out a, you know, say, you know, I reserve the right to supplement this record because we want to see what happens here. Go to the next slide. What I love about this slide right here is that the smoke is going straight up. And many of you who know the gorge know that that's rare. It's very windy out there. And so if there had to have been a derailment at the right time in the right location, this was it, because there was no spread of the fire. The spill drained into the wastewater treatment plant, thank you, you know, containment. There were few fishers on the river. It was not the peak of one of our fisheries. So we had a few, and we communicated with them, and we were able to get them off the river. They did have some impact from the smoke, made their eyes water, and they said it felt uncomfortable, but no lives lost, you know, no fish kill. I mean, there was just so many, and we learned so many lessons about how to participate and how to be ready for spills that I just appreciated this a lot more, because I feel like, you know, going back to the low probability, high consequence event, it's less, you know, people and, you know, looking at this saying, well, maybe it's a higher probability and it's a high consequence event. So next slide. So this is the letter. I love this letter so much. This is from the Governor Inslee, saying that he agreed with the council's decision that to not approve the Tesoro case. He said the risks outweigh the benefits, and he said it's not in public interest. And I think there was a great deal of that was from the diversity of people opposing it, the public information that was out there, but also the Mosier spill. It made us all concerned. I just wanted the decision, just in case you didn't know this, it rested on 3 overriding issues of risk. The risk of earthquake, the unmitigable, I cannot say that word, risk of oil spill that would impact resources in the Columbia River, The potential for fire and explosion at the facility that would impact the surrounding community and the workers who work there. And he quoted, not possible to adequately mitigate the risks or eliminate or minimize the adverse impacts of the facility to an acceptable level. And those are great words. And that's when you're fighting these types of projects, that is like what we're talking about, is risk, and showing that this risk is not just low probability, it's actually higher probability. And again, the tools, the grassroots organizing was phenomenal in this case. It elevated the issue to the general public, which rose to the governor. I mean, this is quite a bit political too. And the governor heard people, and it created space, for diverse interests. And I also want to say, legal and political issues are important, but don't forget technical. Technical is important because, like I said, the first reason he gave was the lack of engineering, up to spec to survive an earthquake, and that was all a bunch of engineers. So technical information and is always good. So quickly, I'm going to finish off with just a quick story about New Star and Zenith, which was formerly ARC Terminals. Next slide, please. So this is what, at the time I took this picture, it was ARC Terminals, changed to Zenith. Both New Star, which was in Vancouver, Washington, and ARC Terminals were similarly sized. They both were asphalt receiverships, and they both wanted to convert to receiving crude, which is they're both petroleum products. So they sort of both were, only needed de minimis changes in their permitting. So that's why they both kind of were able to sneak through. Well, actually, ARC Terminals was a little ahead of New Star, but so when New Star happened, we noticed, and we requested and actually pushed on the city of Vancouver to require a little more review under the Washington state law. The regulation is the State Environmental Policy Act, which is sort of a state version of the national version, NEPA. And I really think, the SEPA review is what killed New Star, because all of a sudden, New Star was going to have to do all of this analysis and technical review, and that killed the project. That's the tool that we did not have in the Zenith Energy, because Oregon doesn't have a SEPA. To fight these projects, we need a variety of tools, and regulatory tools are very useful. I really think that Oregon needs a SEPA. I think it would be great if people have energy to go to their legislators and talk, and build this up, because SEPA is good. It's good just generally to understand what these different projects, what environmental impacts they have. It's good for the public to know that, but particularly for projects like Zenith, I think it would have helped us to get ahead of it before it snuck in and was approved. So that's all I have.
Thank you so much, Julie. This has been such a really great presentation that, educating us about the history of tribal engagement and how these projects have been particularly targeted in their placement, and just really it's inspiring to see how much has happened, and really thinking about, wanting people to be confident that each of our voices matter. This is really making a difference. And when we talk about the Zenith campaign, we've been making these phone calls and signing petitions and wondering if it's working, and we often don't get to know that it's working until they told us we've won. And so I'm just so grateful that you were here to kind of help lay out the tools that have been effective, and also things that we have where we have gaps and need to kind of push for better policy. So that was really great, and I'm sure we could talk for hours. And I appreciate your working within our our webinar, but I hope to continue this conversation further. So this is a great segue to move to Erin Saylor, who's going to talk some more specifically about Zenith. Erin graduated from Lewis and Clark Law School. Erin is one of our staff attorneys at Columbia Riverkeeper. She has a certificate in environment and natural resources law. And after law school, Erin worked for the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency in D.C. for 6 years, in the first in the Office of Water, and then as a civil enforcement attorney in the Waste and Chemical Enforcement Division. In that role, Erin handled a variety of cases under the Toxic Substances Control Act, but is most proud of her work developing a nationally consistent enforcement program for lead paint violations. After taking some time off to focus on her beautiful family, Erin joined Riverkeeper in 2019, where she has been really doing amazing work, primarily focused on fossil fuels. And it's my pleasure to work alongside Erin and to have you here today. So I'll pass to you, Erin. Thank you.
Thanks, Kate, and thank you so much, Julie, for that super informative presentation. It's a hard act to follow, but I think this is a good segue here into just talking more about the specifics of Zenith Energy Terminal Holdings, a little bit about the history, and then kind of where we are right now with the fight against them. So just a little bit about the history. This facility was originally constructed back in 1947, shortly after the end of World War II, as an asphalt refinery. The asphalt refinery shut down at the end of 2008. And like Julie mentioned, in 2013, a company called Arc Logistics purchased it and started handling crude oil around that time. Around 2014, 2015, Arc Logistics obtained a building permit from the city of Portland to construct 3 new rail unloading platforms. And then a few years later, at the end of 2017, Zenith purchased Arc Logistics and the facility and immediately set to work using those building permits to construct new rail unloading platforms for their crude oil operation. In 2018, before they could start using this new rail infrastructure, they had to notify the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality that they had this new equipment and they were going to start using it. At the time, in that notification to DEQ, they characterized the construction as an efficiency project and told DEQ that there would be no new throughput associated with the infrastructure. But what we've actually seen is that Zenith went from handling about 15 million gallons of oil, which is, we're an Olympic year here, so it's about 22 Olympic-sized swimming pools in 2018 to last year in 2020, they handled about 235 million gallons of oil. So that's about 350 Olympic-sized swimming pools worth of oil. So in addition to dramatically increasing the amount of oil that they were bringing through the facility and the number of trains that they were bringing through the gorge in Northeast Portland, they also started handling Bakken crude, which Julie mentioned, you know, it's a more volatile product. It is more likely to explode if there is a derailment. So, you know, that's another way that they had told DEQ, we're not changing our throughput. At the time that they told DEQ that, they were only handling the tar sands oil from Canada. By 2019, they were handling this more volatile Bakken crude product. In 2019, I won't get into all of the crazy specific legal details here, but Zenith started to seek permits from the city to build additional rail infrastructure on top of the 3 new racks that they'd already constructed that they've claimed will primarily be used for biofuels. So they tried to do this a couple different ways. First, they wanted to build new pipes under Northwest Front Avenue across the street to Chevron's dock, which is the dock that they use to ship out their oil. In order to do that, they would have to have gotten a change to what's called a franchise agreement, which is basically a contract that they have with the city to build and maintain the pipes that run under that city street. So the city said, no, we're not going to allow you to do that because once those are constructed, we have no way to prove that you're not going to use them for crude oil. that you're only going to use them for biofuels, like you say. So Zenith decided if they can't go under Northwest Front Avenue, they would go over Northwest Front Avenue. And instead of going to the Chevron's dock, they were going to try to go to McCall Oil's dock, which is immediately next to Chevron's and across the street from Zenith as well. In order to do that, the new pipes that they were going to construct would have gone through what's referred to as the Greenway, which is a section of land that's right up against the Willamette River and has some more stringent land use requirements involved in order to ensure protection of the river. Once the city started asking some really tough questions about how they intended to meet all of these additional land use requirements, Zenith pulled back and withdrew that application, and then submitted applications to the city to construct the new rail racks solely within its property. So instead of building new pipes under or over Northwest Front Avenue, now what they're pursuing is to construct new rail racks solely on their property, which they're saying again is only going to be used for biofuels. But by limiting it to their property, they're really limiting the city's review basically to the zoning code. So a lot of the other considerations that came into effect with the land use review and the franchise agreement just aren't on the table anymore. It's just really a straight building permit application. So we're expecting that the city is going to probably approve those pretty soon. So where we are right now, like Julie mentions, Oregon doesn't have a state environmental policy act or a SEPA. So we're really left kind of chipping away at these permit processes that are available that Zenith is currently going through. And the big one that's on the table right now is the renewal of their Title V air permit with the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality. So the situation at Zenith is pretty unique in the sense that the permit was actually expired back in 2012 and has been administratively extended because ARC Terminals had gotten a renewal application in before the expiration date that allows DEQ to allow Zenith. So let me back up. So Zenith is allowed to continue to operate under this expired permit until DEQ comes forward and issues the renewal permit. So in that time, all of this construction has happened on the property in the time that the permit has been expired. And typically DEQ requires what's called a land use compatibility statement when someone is applying for a new permit, but they also require a new land use compatibility statement for renewal permits where there have been substantial increases in or intensification of the activities on the property, or there have been substantial modifications to the property. And so, we argued very heavily to DEQ that both of those have happened here in the sense in Zenith's case, and that DEQ should be requiring Zenith to submit a new land use compatibility statement. So DEQ eventually agreed with us on that point. And Zenith has now in the position where they have to apply to the city of Portland for a land use compatibility statement, which looks at the entire facility, all of the operations there, not just the new biofuel, but the new rail racks, the increase in throughput, the change from handling just tar sands oil from Canada to also handling this Bakken crude. All of that right now is before the city, to consider. And what the city is supposed to be looking at during this process is all of the policies in City of Portland's 2035 comprehensive plan, and also the zoning codes that they have on the books. So it is, once again, we're in this position where the city is not limited to just the zoning code, which has kind of tied their hands with issuing the building permits, but going back to those fights with the pipes where they have the opportunity to look outside of that to general city policy about there's lots of things that the city can rely on to what we hope that they will deny the Lux. So, there's a policy that in the comp plan that says that they need to consider the effects to not just the four corners of the property, but also, effects that are happening outside of the property, and paying particular attention to those that put extra pressure on BIPOC communities. So if you could go to the next slide, please. You'll see here that Zenith's trains, most likely they come in down through the gorge and then through Northeast Portland and through an area of the city where there are a large number of BIPOC and lower income communities. So, the pictures that Julie showed you earlier of those train derailments, those areas were extremely fortunate in that they weren't highly populated. Imagine those same pictures in a neighborhood in St. John's or somewhere else in Northeast Portland. That's like Julie said, that's going to be a really high impact event, and it's going to be absolutely catastrophic for the city. So we want the city to do what Washington did with New Star and say that the risks of these facilities outweigh the benefits. And in Zenith's case, the benefits are very, very, very few, because none of that product that they're moving into the city is being used locally within Oregon. It's 100% being put on tanker ships and sent out to refineries. So, we're arguing to the city, and, the great activists, we've had so many neighborhood associations right now that have voiced their concerns about this as well. We've had so many folks come forward to city council and building development services, who's responsible for issuing the Lux, just to say like that the risks here are far, far, far too great compared to the non-existent benefits. And so we want the city of Portland to deny this land use compatibility statement. And practically what happens if they deny it is, if the city doesn't sign off on the land use, then Zenith can't get their Title V air permit. And if they don't get the air permit, then they can't operate. So realistically, what's going to happen if the city does deny it is Zenith will almost certainly challenge that, and there will be a period of time where it's still being administratively extended while that battle's taking place. But, we think that the city has a lot of good arguments to withstand that kind of legal challenge here. So we're hoping that they take that leap and deny the land use compatibility statement. Can you go to the next slide, please? So these are just some of the great activist photos that have to do with a lot of the campaigns that we've had against Zenith over the last few years. Can you go to the next slide, please? So DEQ is planning in August 10th at 6 p.m. to put on a big public information session. This is not going to be a place where folks will have the opportunity to provide testimony on the specific permits. I'm fairly certain that there is the opportunity to ask questions, but it's not really a place to come out and testify against the permits. But what DEQ is planning to do here is to have the permit writers for all of the current permits that are pending before DEQ. So Zenith's Title V air permit, they're seeking a construction stormwater permit for the new biofuels rail racks. And then also their spill contingency plan. So DEQ is planning to have the experts from the agency that are involved in each one of these be available for questions to give an overview about all of those pieces and how the agency is looking at them holistically, hopefully. So if you want to attend that, please go ahead and fill out that RSVP link that we have there. We'll be sending it out via email later on, and you can also find it on DEQ's website. There will be a separate public hearing for Zenith construction stormwater permit on August 19th, and that will be the standard public hearing where there's an opportunity to provide feedback on the permit and, provide testimony about that permit. So I just talked really fast, but I think that's everything I wanted to present at the moment, and we can answer some questions, I think.
Yeah, thank you, Erin. There's so much we're packing into an hour, and I know we just have a few more minutes. I did get an okay from Erin and Julie to go a couple minutes extra with our questions. But yeah, thank you for kind of tying this together and how it relates to Zenith. I know this can be really confusing because there's so many different elements that are going on with this particular campaign. And so I'm just gonna review that, like right now we're really focused on the city council. They have an opportunity to say no and deny this land use compatibility statement, basically to say this isn't compatible with our goals for the future. And they're really kind of teetering about that decision. It feels like they haven't quite made up their minds. And so right now is so critical for folks to make those phone calls, spread the word with your friends, sign the petition. It's really important right now that they're hearing from everyone. I put in the chat a couple of links and all the phone numbers to the commissioners. My hope is that everyone, when they get off of this webinar, will take 5 minutes to quickly just call and leave a message for each of the commissioners, sign that petition, tell a few of your friends. I mean, just 5 minutes after the webinar. And if everyone does that, we can get a huge amount of calls, just a rush of calls right now. Likely you'll be leaving a message. It's really easy. It takes just a second to do it. And if we can fill up these, continue filling up their voicemails and letting them know that the community really cares about that, that's going to be really important to do right now. And then if they do, for some reason, decide to approve in some manner this land use decision, then we're going to all quickly pivot our focus to DEQ, the Department of Environmental Quality, who is making a decision about the Title V permit. And that's when we're going to actually have a public engagement process. So that's kind of like the distilled version, because there's so many details. But right now, push on the city, and then we're going to see how that works out. And then we may need to do some focus on DEQ. And I'm just really appreciative, Julie and Erin, of both of you. When I think back a year ago about where we were with Zenith and how much progress we've made between the legal work that's been done, the amazing collaboration between coalitions and community members and neighborhood associations coming forward in opposition to this project. This is exactly what Julie was talking about with getting that diversity of voices, bringing frontline voices to the front where they can speak about how they're disproportionately burdened and what those solutions are. Anyway, I'm really excited about this, y'all, and I'm excited about making this the summer that we really stop Zenith. I have a couple questions. If folks have questions, put them in the chat. We're also going to capture the chat and try to follow up with folks if we don't get to your questions. But I'll just start really quickly. One question that it came up is, how can people support the work that CritFic is doing? Julie, I'll let you answer that. And in the meantime, I'll go ahead and repost that link for CritFic's website for folks to learn more.
I think that, let me back up, sorry. I think the most important thing that non-tribal people can do is to understand that to respect tribes' sovereignty and autonomy. Tribes aren't environmental groups, and sometimes they make decisions to support their own economies that may not align with what you think should happen. And so just being respectful of that, I think is the key. I just wanted to put a little plug for Columbia Riverkeeper. Riverkeeper has been a great ally and understands that. But when the tribes do speak, support where they are, and and like with any community, impacts will be a little bit different, and perspectives will be a little bit different. But just being open to that, I think is the best way to be.
Thank you, Julie. And yes, that is very true. Also, I'm just going to ask Gabby, who's running our tech. Thank you, Gabby and Karina, for helping us with tech. If you want to put up the contact slide, which was the last slide, if you can, while we're talking, and then folks can see our contact info if they want to follow up with any of us. Another question I see in the chat is, this is probably more for Aaron. The sense that I get is the city's nervous about litigation. If the city denied the Lux, can you explain why they might be on sound legal footing to deny the permit? Do you have any input on why we think that that is a good legal standing?
Yeah, and I think I'd prefer not to get too deep into the legal justification for all of this, but in a nutshell, the city has to provide findings, whether they deny it or approve it, which is basically where they go through and they say, you know, either this is why we think it fits the comp plan, or this is why we think it doesn't fit the comp plan. And our read is that they have much stronger arguments to deny it and say why it doesn't fit the comp plan. Otherwise, there's so many policies within the comp plan that have to do with, you know, limiting fossil fuel infrastructure to that necessary to serve the regional market. They're going to have to find a way to explain how Zenith fits that. They're also going to have to, there's probably 6 or 7 having to do with seismic safety concerns. And then there's also ones about, you know, limiting air impacts and limiting risks to BIPOC communities. And so I think it's going to be really tough for the city to go through all those policies and say, yes, this project is in compliance with all of those. And I think, Nick, you also had a question about the timing on the Lux decision from the city of Portland. It's probably, I think soonish is probably a good way to put it. We don't really know for certain, but it could be within the next couple weeks.
Yes, thank you, Erin. And I am not an attorney, but I would just say that I think, you know, the circumstances have changed. And if we don't really step up and make bold decisions about protective actions, the planet is going to make those decisions for us. So we're at a point right now where we have to do things that are not the standard, and we have to encourage our elected officials to be brave and be bold and be less afraid of a lawsuit than they are of the ocean on fire. And that's kind of, I think, you know, as the circumstances shift and the climate emergency is upon us, we have to make more drastic changes and be able to stand up. And I hope that the city will understand that they have overwhelming opposition to this project in the community. The community will back them up. So the community does not want this project and these threats to our health and safety. So I think, you know, this is just, times are changing, and I think we've seen examples of communities taking these steps to step outside of the box and protect the communities that they're in. So I think we're at a really interesting point where things are shifting, and I think that the power is on our side to protect the planet, and people understand that fossil fuels have to stay in the ground. So I think we're really, I'm excited about the progress that's happening. I know it always kind of feels slow with these things, but yes. And I apologize that we couldn't get to more of your questions. There's so many good questions that I'm seeing too. We will be sending out follow-up email for folks. So I'm going to try and include as many of the links as possible from the chat, so that all of this info is in one place to anyone who RSVP'd. And please feel free to follow up. We do have a couple, there will be a Zenith event coming up later this summer that is in the process of being organized. It's going to be very family friendly, open for folks to get involved in. There's also some Zenith Pedopalooza rides and some other things around town, so keep your eyes peeled for that. We're very appreciative of all of you for attending.